Video ready to roll, great. And this is Stephen Chown, ex-president of SCAR, who has a lot of knowledge how science is used within the Antarctic Treaty System, and I think he has some thought-provoking things to say.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for enabling me to give this presentation to you today. In essence, I want to deal with the relationship between SCAR as a knowledge broker, a scientific knowledge broker, and the policymakers in the Antarctic Treaty System. I'll focus specifically on the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings and the meetings of the Committee for Environmental Protection in the talk, deal less with SCAR's role in the Convention on Antarctic Marine Living Resources. To begin with, where does the advice that SCAR gives the Antarctic Treaty parties come from? Well, it's quite straightforward. It takes the form of working papers, which are papers that go into the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings and have to be discussed by the chair of whatever meeting it's part of, and information papers, which generally provide information and don't necessarily have to be discussed. Those papers prepared by SCAR are typically based on peer-reviewed published research, but sometimes they are published also or produced also on the basis of international policy reports, science policy reports, such as those of the IPCC, and in particular, most recently, the sixth assessment reports. But other reports are also used, such as those of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And SCAR has used both vehicles when talking about climate change to the Antarctic Treaty parties and to other members of the Antarctic Treaty System. And notably, an evidence synthesis produced as the ACCE, or Antarctic Climate Change and the Environment Report in 2009. And then in 2022, the Decadal Synopsis, which was an update on the original report, and in its case, based on the IPCC and IPBES reports themselves. So that's essentially where the advice comes from that SCAR delivers into the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. One might then ask, to what extent is the advice provided leading to policy change? And from one perspective, one might have a fairly negative view, thinking especially about the projected temperature rise from the 1990 assessment report, the first one at the IPCC, and what we're seeing essentially this year. And you can see that from the top right-hand graph from Copernicus, the program of the European Union, indicating where current temperatures are for this year. And of course, the sea ice anomalies illustrated below from a recent paper by Pirich and Doddridge, which has just come out in Comms, Earth and Environment. We knew what was coming, one might say, but very little policy was in fact enacted to ensure that greenhouse gas emissions were sufficiently reduced that we did not end up in the situation we are today. That's one perspective, and one might argue that the reason for this is that the science advice is, of course, interpreted through a policy lens. And one can see that the policy lens itself has to do with the world we live in now and how it's been transforming over the past several years. These four book titles just give you an indication that there's tremendous difficulty across the world at the moment, and that difficulty will in fact influence the decisions that are made in any international agreement. And we may then classify that as the relationship between reliable knowledge, or the sorts of information we think is worth presenting through repeatedly peer-reviewed presentations, such as those of the, and syntheses, such as those of the IPCC. And of course, then there's the appetite for the evidence that's being provided. And we often think that we should end up in the top right-hand corner, in other words, with evidence-based decisions, effective policy that takes those into consideration, engaged and informed dialogue, research funded in priority areas. But frequently, we seem to be heading towards the lower left-hand corner, where we have knowledge that's not entirely reliable. We need more information. And when we have all sorts of ideological decisions or positions of strength being set forth, and in a situation which we don't find entirely comfortable. Of course, we also see that we're being pushed towards the bottom right-hand corner, where we have ideology overcoming the reliable information that's already available. So if we think of this situation, it's worth considering where, given the situation globally, we currently sit with the Antarctic Treaty System and the advice that SCAR has provided. So as a recap for those who don't know the Antarctic Treaty System well, there's the treaty itself of 1959 and the annual Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings at which the consultative parties make decisions. There's some other parties too, of course. Non-consultative parties, they make decisions about the area south of 60 degrees south. There's the Camelot Convention and its commissioners, and that area extends in the Southern Ocean up to about the Antarctic Polar Front. And there are some other agreements, and notably, of course, the operation of the Committee for Environmental Protection within the Antarctic Treaty System that was brought forth as a consequence of the Environmental Protocol that was signed in 1991 and came into force in 1998. The observers that can contribute working papers that have to be discussed, SCAR, COMNAP are the two main ones, but of course, Camelot itself also reports into the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. And then there are experts who are present at those meetings, such as the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, perhaps the only way that civil society generally has a voice in these meetings. The industry body for tourism, that's the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, and WMO is also present along with other experts. The treaty itself isn't divorced entirely from the operations of the United Nations, and SCAR, of course, is Special Committee of the International Science Council. So this is more or less the set of groupings that operate in the Antarctic Treaty System. Now, with respect to climate change, the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties have had a long interest. For example, in 1989, and bearing in mind, of course, the treaty parties first met in 1961, in 1989, they made a declaration recognizing the role Antarctica and the Southern Ocean play in regulating the total Earth system, and that declaration included a statement about climate change and the extent to which polar amplification may be important. And of course, you may have been discussing polar amplification at the meeting over the last few days. At the same meeting, they also indicated that they were very interested in a meeting that SCAR was going to arrange, an Antarctic Science Conference in 1991, and part of that conference was to be about the impacts of, or at least the extent to which climate change might be detected in the Antarctic and how it might play out. So this is a history of interest in climate change that predates the first IPCC assessment report by about a year, but obviously the activity had been ongoing in the climate change arena for some time prior to that. And in fact, these reports reflect activity undertaken by SCAR. So in 1988, SCAR's bulletin indicated that SCAR would be part of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program that was seeking to understand, among other things, the changing world and the interactions between different components of that changing world. SCAR had, of course, also started discussing the meeting that was to be held in 1991, and it had put into the treaty meetings itself the information that it was taking part in the IGBP and was due to hold this meeting in 1991. So in effect, there's a good relationship between SCAR reporting into the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties, and that in itself is not surprising because that relationship between SCAR and the Antarctic Treaty parties had been well established since the very first meeting of the parties, and in fact also since the very first meeting of SCAR, because SCAR was well aware of the political developments that were taking place as a consequence of the International Geophysical Year that was held in 1957-58 period. One can then explore, in a climate change setting anyway, this relationship between SCAR's advice to the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties and their response in return. So if we look at the timeline here, in 1991, SCAR reported on the meeting that it had held, especially a global change in Antarctica research workshop. SCAR then reported in again on Antarctica and global processes in 1992, By 1995, it had formed a group known as Global Change in Antarctica. That was a research program within SCAR. Between 1996 and 2008, SCAR submitted several papers into the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings. The landmark report on Antarctic climate change and the environment, led by John Turner, was submitted by SCAR as an information paper in 2009. For about 10 years, SCAR then continued to update the ACCE reports, especially through the group established in SCAR to do so. And in 2022, the decadal synopsis was presented to the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties as working papers 30 and 31, and of course the report itself was launched at the Berlin meeting. And finally, in response to the treaty parties suggesting that a day on climate change should be held in Helsinki, SCAR also provided further updates on its decadal synopsis and new research that had emerged since the 2022 meeting. So there's a clear timeline here of SCAR's involvement, and there's more or less, if you can keep that previous slide in mind, the response by the treaty parties that's very similar. There was a recognition of SCAR's meeting in the 91 report, and then from there on, recommendations, they were known as recommendations, and until the differences between decisions, measures, and resolutions were put forward. There was a recommendation on initiatives in global change in 92. There was a decision that there should be a meeting of experts, in part based on SCAR's report, and that meeting was held in 2010. There was a resolution on SCAR's climate change and the environment report that was in part precipitated by the 2010 Antarctic Treaty meeting of experts. There's another resolution on global, and the role of Antarctica in global climate processes in 2015. Another resolution on Antarctica and a changing climate in 2021. A resolution following the decadal synopsis, and of course the Helsinki Declaration put forward as Resolution 2 in 2023. So if you bear these two timelines in mind, you can see that the timeline of SCAR's advice and the treaty parties acting on SCAR's advice and making decisions on how they wish to proceed is very clear. And it comes out in other ways too. Of course, it's clear in the work plans of the Committee for Environmental Protection and the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties themselves. So climate change is a significant issue in the Antarctic Treaty meetings, and I think there should be wide recognition of the significant work done by many, many hundreds, perhaps thousands of scientists within SCAR and elsewhere that has given rise to this tremendous focus on climate change and its impacts in both the Antarctic region and for the Earth system that have held the attention of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties. So in essence, that's a very positive outcome from the work that's been done by SCAR and the SCAR scientific advice into the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings, acting as an effective knowledge broker and a trusted one. SCAR, of course, undertook this knowledge brokerage role not only by putting forward these documents in the formal meetings, but through its annual lectures. Here's a glimpse of all the annual lectures, or in the case of 2023, a short presentation alongside an annual lecture that wasn't quite focused on climate change that have taken place. So you can see SCAR has repeatedly introduced the topic and had explainers about climate change or associated changes to the Antarctic system and the implications for the rest of the planet, and notably from Tim Naish's 2017 SCAR lecture and the continuation that was associated finally with the development of the decadal synopsis and its introduction by Professor Hans Otto Pertner in the 2022 Berlin meeting. So in essence, this is an extremely positive development of this good relationship on climate change advice and policy responses by the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties. But things have changed slightly more recently. So for example, in 2023, the Russian Federation was of the opinion that the subsidiary bodies of the ATCM, including SCAR and COMNAP, should comply with the ATCM mandate. And of course, this is incorrect, since SCAR is not a subsidiary body of the ATCM and nor is COMNAP, but the statement was felt to be necessary by the Russian Federation and is included in working paper 57 they submitted. Just the previous year, in the 44th Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting, China expressed concerns on whether SCAR was the appropriate body to be making policy recommendations. So there's been some indication within the meetings, and of course in the dialogue in the meetings, this is clear, that there is a concern about SCAR's knowledge brokerage role within these particular meetings. And it's spilled over now into the international scientific literature. In September 2023, Bai and Lee put out this paper in Marine Policy, a well-respected policy journal, indicating that SCAR is likely to be controlled by political factors for a bunch of reasons. They had a quantitative, or at least semi-quantitative, and qualitative analysis. And their view was that SCAR is likely to become politically driven as a consequence of how it's funded. And it's funded, of course, through the national academies of different countries, but those countries tend both to have SCAR membership and Antarctic Treaty Consultative Party membership. Of course, right in the beginning, they were entirely overlapping. They are no longer. And then, of course, that the 7 claimant states and the USA and USSR had an unduly large influence on SCAR. And as a consequence, for the convenience of national interests, membership of SCAR might be strengthened by states, and that would drive the SCAR agenda. So we can see both inside the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings themselves, and to some extent within CAMLR, and of course now in the international scientific literature, there's this indication that SCAR is somehow collaborating more with certain parties, and that it's collaborating more generally with countries, and that this is something to be tremendously concerned about. Much of the analysis in this paper by Bai and Lee, there are very many errors in it, but much of the analysis, of course, does not take into consideration what the baseline situation is. And the changes in the treaty itself may be a consequence of the fact that questions are becoming more complicated, countries are responding, countries are also realizing that these are not problems they can deal with on their own, and that collaboration is important. And I'll give you 2 illustrations of why I think this is the case, and why SCAR is not likely to be influenced by the sorts of things that are set out in this paper, or indeed by the kinds of things that are being stated by particular parties in the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings themselves. So the first is that if you look at all papers submitted by parties, and of course the count here means that some papers are counted more than once, and SCAR collaborative papers, yes, the 7 claimants in the USA and Russia produce more papers with SCAR, but they do so simply because of the fact that there's almost a continual progression between the numbers of papers produced and the extent to which you might, in fact, then start to collaborate with SCAR as a country. In other words, there's a progression of activity as your activity increases. So the likelihood of becoming involved in scientific activities increases, and the likelihood of having some sort of collaboration with SCAR goes up. As you might expect, observers typically and experts typically collaborate more with SCAR. If you look at the proportion of party collaborative papers, in other words, how much does a country actually collaborate with another country with SCAR, countries collaborate far more amongst themselves, and there's a very rapid increase in that collaboration over the years relative to the collaborations with SCAR, starting at 1972, because that's the first paper that SCAR put into the Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings. So these concerns have no real foundation in the empirical information. And just to confirm that the empirical information does not allow you to understand motivation anyway. So perhaps this is a consequence of differences in national perspective. China, for example, has sustainable use as a national perspective compared, say, with Antarctica and New Zealand's case, representing the views of New Zealand that Antarctica and the Southern Ocean should be valued, protected, and understood. So that's one reason where we may get the situation arising. The second reason is that if one thinks about super wicked problems in the language of Kelly Levin and colleagues, then this may be another driver for expecting that there may be some complexities with the science policy interface. In this case, in the case of super wicked problems, time is running out. Those seeking to end the problem are also the cause of it. There's no central authority. In the case of the ATCPs, the treaty consultative parties, They are a central authority, but they meet once a year. And of course, those that are seeking to change the situation are also those that are causing it. And finally, policies tend to discount the future irrationally, and that's certainly the case with climate change. So this combination of national interests and super wicked problems leads us to significant challenges. And that is that national concerns are likely to overwhelm interest in reliable knowledge, even though the knowledge is coming in is a completely different driver for decision making. At the limit, new methods may be sought to cast doubt on reliability. In other words, to just shake up the argument so the argument does not actually look carefully at the evidence. For example, at the Berlin meeting in 2022, 2 papers were introduced dealing with polar bears and the extent to which polar bears and emperor penguins should be considered the same way, and how the information on them was unreliable. Both papers had as the basis for their construction climate denying blogs. In the science case, of course, sustained neglect of advice might drive scientists towards advocacy. There's no reason why scientists shouldn't be advocates as some members of civil society, but often if the advocacy becomes too sustained, then it's difficult for policymakers to find a difference between what the science advice is and what is actually advocacy based on that advice. And when these sorts of things occur, then progress on solutions may well falter. The solutions, I think anyway, drawn at least a little from Kelly Levin and colleagues' papers, is new coalitions can help get through these problems, new science coalitions, new policy coalitions, new coalitions of collaborators. We might focus on lower order internal policy successes, so not always trying to achieve the major success, but looking at others that could be formulated in the interim. Thinking about other international agreements where agreement could actually be achieved, where there could be greater success than perhaps a difficulty in the Antarctic Treaty System itself. And I think sustaining ambition, in other words, not letting difficulties drive one away from putting forth the information that's coming forward, making it clear what the risks are, making it clear what the timelines are, and what the implications and impacts could be for the rest of the Earth system. And of course, collaborations with other sectors could be equally important, such as the World Economic Forum or the business sector or insurance sector. And finally, just clarity of messaging, making sure that it's absolutely clear what's coming out of the science and what the implications are. I think if one looks at a solution that's less easily articulated, it strikes me that we should remember that there are critical transitions in society as well as in nature. And I'm aware of course, the title of this conference and the thoughts behind the Instant program itself. And I would say one should just remember how systems may change. Small changes may lead to very large surprises, shall we say. And in this sense, I don't necessarily think we should imagine we're somewhere up on this curve here, still trying to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, we may be somewhere towards a critical transition. So I think in sum, the overall perspective on the relationship between the sorts of science that you've been talking about here and have been discussing and eventually publish is actually having a huge effect on policy in the Antarctic Treaty System. That effect is now starting to have some difficulty as a consequence of the fact that there's little time left and there are pressing national interests. But that does not mean we should continue with the sorts of work we've been doing. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for enabling me to make this presentation while not being there. I really miss being amongst you all in Trieste. And I would like to end then by thanking everybody that has supported my research, the Australian Research Council, Monash University, and of course, many who've contributed to my thinking over the years. Thank you.
Okay,